Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tsai City. If this is your first time, welcome to Tsai City. And if this is your coming back, welcome back. It's so good to see you all virtually. I'm Matt Garrett. I am an innovation fellow here at Tsai City. Essentially, my role is to help you all think innovatively or really just help build your ventures. It's a little bit of everything. Before we get into our design thinking workshop with Ellen Sue, I did want to go over a few things. One, feel free to pop in with questions or anything like that in the chat, or if you feel that you want to, feel free to unmute your mic as well. However, when Ellen is going over things and just when other people are talking, please keep your mics muted. That way we can all hear it effectively. There's no feedback or anything happening at this point. Pretty general, I think Zoom rules, as I think we're all gotten pretty used to at this point. Then the other things I just want to go over. One of our really key things that we do at Tsai City and really values that we take priority on is making sure that we are inclusive and everyone feels welcome. So if in any way that's not the case here at Tsai City, please feel free to let me or anyone at Tsai City know. It's our job to help make this place feel inclusive and that you feel welcomed. We're always super willing to take feedback on that. One other thing that I do want to bring up attention to, there is a lot going on, especially with Kevin Jiang and other things happening. So if you need any support, unfortunately, I'm not a counselor or am I trained in that. However, thankfully, we do have resources here at Yale. That's what we can see on the screen at the moment. So if you need any support, feel free to reach out to any of these supports. Really, we can get you, if you're not sure where to go, feel free to let us know here at Tsai City and where to go. We can definitely get you to the right place. With all of that, I want to introduce Ellen Sue, who's going to teach us all about design thinking. Ellen is a fantastic founder, innovator in so many different ways. Just as someone who just came to the Tsai City team back in August, got to know Ellen just a little bit. She's been a really awesome resource for myself. I've already learned a lot. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about design thinking from her. And the floor is all yours, Ellen. And I will stop
Excellent.
slowly.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining on a Monday evening. It's good to see you all here, and thank you for your time and for joining me on this somewhat dreary evening in New Haven. So, like Matt said, I'm Ellen Sue. I graduated from Yale in 2013. My background is in product design and engineering. I was technically an art major, and since then I co-founded a startup, got acquired, joined the new startup as the chief product officer, and so I've been working in products, both physical, digital, and now actually moving into services. So really excited to see you all here. I kind of cut my teeth on design thinking and human-centered design. Really feel strongly that it is an essential part of creating products and services that really are serving the people that you're trying to help. So without further ado, I will be sharing my screen with a presentation, but I will also actually be jumping back and forth between both my previous startup and the startup that I'm at now. So both of them are going to be very medical device focused, but a lot of these principles will apply more broadly. Feel free to jump in with any questions. Might be easiest if you put in questions in the chat, and I'm happy to kind of answer and keep an eye on that as I move along. But yeah, so I will be sharing a lot of the kind of design thinking principles through the lens of how we applied that kind of in two different types of startups. So you'll actually get to see behind the scenes of a lot of the planning documents and a lot of the stuff that we've been doing, and you can see kind of firsthand how we put that into practice. So really excited to share that with you guys. So I'm actually going to be pinging back and forth between this presentation and kind of very specific examples. All right, so can you all see my screen? Excellent. All right, so that's the first thing. So let's start this presentation. Okay, so design thinking. I gave a little introduction of myself, so I'll go into a little bit more detail with this. So the first startup that I founded, and this is where it gets a little confusing. I founded a startup called Wellings. It was acquired by another startup that then renamed itself to Wellings. So that's just the slightly confusing thing. So the original Wellings was actually focused. When I talk about it, I'll actually talk about our product, which was Cinch, which was smart straps for scoliosis braces. We basically created a device and app and kind of this whole platform for tracking how kids were wearing their scoliosis braces as a way to prevent surgery. What I work on now is actually devices and products and software for managing end-to-end respiratory health. So we work primarily with folks with COPD and asthma, and we basically help monitor both using diagnostic devices as well as an app, self-reported data, combining that with oversight from the doctor. And actually, we're in the process of building out a new kind of virtual respiratory therapy offering. So there's a lot of fun stuff going on in the background, particularly timely. And it's a field that I think has been a lot more accepting of technology. So there's a lot of experience in digital health, and happy to talk a little bit more about that if that's something that you're interested in. So I will be kind of talking about the design thinking principles through the lens of my experience in digital health and through starting these companies. All right, so I will actually dive into just really quick, starting off with definition. So what is design thinking? There's a lot of approaches to this. You'll hear a lot about it from kind of various different folks. You may know a little bit of it already, but at its core, it's essentially a framework for innovation here. This is an image that I really like because I think it really drives home one of the core principles is that design thinking is cyclical. So you never actually stop this process. It's actually an iterative process. So really what it means is that you can kind of think of it as similar to the scientific method. So it is a process of understanding, of testing, of prototyping, of collecting data, and then feeding that back into your understanding. So for those of you with the science background, it is very similar to the scientific method where you're creating a hypothesis, you're testing it, you're running experiments, and you're feeding that understanding back into your next experiment. But here, you're working with people and you're building, not necessarily products, but you're building things to help people and solve problems. So it goes by a couple of different forms. This one lays out the various pieces as empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. You'll often see in the kind of lean startup world, you'll see things called build, measure, learn. Here's another way of thinking of it, which is, you have an inspiration or a challenge or a problem that you're solving. You are kind of creating a lot of options. So you can think of this as like the number of things that you're considering. So, you're creating a lot of ideas, you're narrowing in on the important ones, you're testing those out, and you're kind of trying out different iterations, and then you're narrowing in again on what you're going to actually put out to people. And again, you're going to see a lot of these cyclical images. The first one is really my favorite one. But here it's all a process of getting feedback. So it's all kind of part of the same cycle, but really it's a process of build, measure, learn. And so, and as you learn, you take those learnings and you feed that into your next kind of cycle and your next test. And this might look a little bit different depending on if you're building, a for-profit business with a physical product, or you're building a service or a nonprofit organization. But at the end of the day, you should really be kind of tying that back to the people that you're trying to work with. So I will step through kind of each of these steps, and really what we do is we start with the people. So the who that you're designing for. I also saw that someone raised their hand. Happy to take a pause here before we move into that. Let's see.
I raised my hand. I was just curious about these different frameworks for understanding the design thinking process. Particularly, I understand the cyclical one and different iterations of that. And I also understand the diverge converge cycles, how do they map to one another? Are there particular phases of the cycle that map to converge or map to diverge?
Yes, absolutely. So, I would say if we were to go back to the cyclical one, you kind of have your empathize is where you're trying to get an understanding from people. So that's a diverging process. Defining is sharpening it in. You're focusing in on the problem. So that's a converge. As you're ideating, that's another diverge where you're putting a lot of things, a lot of ideas on the table. And then when you go to prototype, you actually need to diverge again because you have limited resources and you can't test everything. So you're kind of like, so here you're kind of diverging here, converging here, diverging in the ideate, converging in prototype and test. And then from there, you actually expand back out into empathize. So they actually do kind of map pretty consistently in these processes. But yeah, it's really, it hopefully helps make sure that you're not pigeonholing yourself too far down into specific ideas that don't necessarily match up with the experiences of the people that you're trying to help. Yeah, all right. So let's jump into the empathize portion, or the who. This is one of the kind of general, you can't design for somebody when you don't know who you're designing for. It is really hard to make things in a vacuum, and there's kind of one school of thought where people make things just to solve problems that they have, and then you assume that if I have this problem and I solve it, there's probably someone else like me who has this problem, so I might be solving this problem for someone else too. That, I think, is a very limiting point of view, in that you are serving a kind of a very narrow slice of the population. Now, there's kind of like a very big rabbit hole that you can go into with the kind of empathize portion, but really with this, it's identifying people that need help and figuring out kind of who are you helping and who are you not helping. And this can actually be really complicated. And I think the impulse is to say, I want to help a lot of people. And then on the flip side, you can say, here's this one person that I want to help, and I'm thinking that this person is representative of a lot of people. So there's a whole process of like data gathering and understanding that you're trying to do. And I think this ties hand in hand with the why. So why are you trying to help them, or what is the problem that you're solving for them? But you kind of need both. So one of the things that we try to do is, the who actually might be determined by your business model. So you might say, here's a very large underserved market. Here's a group of people that are chronically, they don't have a lot of good solutions or options available to them. Or here's a group of people with a problem that's not being solved right now. And so, that can help you sharpen the who that you're helping. Or, it can be very personal, right? You can take that from your personal experience. So to the example of Cinch, which is the scoliosis product, the who in that was, my co-founder, the CTO of the company, he had scoliosis when he was younger. So the who was people like him. He had scoliosis, he had worn a brace, he had ended up needing spinal fusion surgery, had titanium rods implanted in his spine, had a staph infection, had to undergo another major surgery to get them out. So he wanted to help other kids who were, in middle school and high school, kind of back when he was going through that. He wanted to help them avoid that process. So that can be a really strong story for the who. For the product that we're working on right now, which is in respiratory health, the original device that we designed was a portable nebulizer. And the co-founder of the company, who was an emergency room doctor, he was at the airport and he saw someone vaping, and he was traveling with his daughter who had severe asthma, and she had these medications that she had to nebulize. She had a bunch of inhalers, and she had this nebulizer that was very loud, very bulky. And he was basically saying, like, if we can create these small, sleek devices to deliver, nicotine and other kind of addictive substances into people's lungs, why can't we do that with medications? So that can, that often comes up when you have a very personal connection, because usually that is what helps you identify some of those problems. So you start to understand the who, and like I said, I'm going to tie it closely to the why, and then we'll talk a little bit about there and show some strategies for how to tease out some of the insights there. So what are the problems that you're solving for your stakeholders? Now, here's something that we were also looking into, which was when we were starting off with scoliosis. So we started off and said, okay, we're going to focus on scoliosis. Let's try to understand what we can. What are the problems in this process? And those insights come from a variety of sources. So this is where you're really doing research. You're essentially, a mentor of mine called it getting a Google PhD. You're basically becoming an expert just by searching wherever you can. And that can take a combination of checking news sites. So, we were lucky in that there was a major article that was being published in the New York Times, and we were talking to the research team that had pulled together that data. So it was before that article even got published. We also went to the Yale New Haven Hospital Spine Center, and we just sat and shadowed people. Now, it's a little bit tougher these days to just show up at a hospital clinic and say, like, can I just sit here and watch people move in and out? So you do have to, there are some particular challenges there. But it's just being around and understanding the process for the people who are going through experiencing the problem that you're seeing. And you can learn a lot outside of just interviewing people directly. We also went to a support group meeting for a local support group chapter for kids with scoliosis, and we also just happened to end up on local news because the local news was highlighting them as well. And we went to a brace company, a brace manufacturer. And so we tried to just sit and understand, who are all the pieces in this process? Who are all the people that are involved? What we're doing now is with the respiratory side, we're interviewing people that have respiratory conditions. We are having them walk us through their user journey or their experience of their condition. And what we've created from there, and to get a better understanding, are these kind of journey maps. So I will show you an example of one of them. So for example, we've got someone named Brooke. So she's someone that who is a nebulizer user. So she has our product. We sent out an email to everybody and said, hey, would you be willing to talk to us about your patient journey, your diagnosis journey, kind of how you went through this process, and for us to get a better understanding of, how do people relate to their condition. And so we basically spent an hour interviewing her, and we created this map. So we tried to understand, what are her goals in her life and in her treatment. What are the things that are particularly challenging? She was actually great. She uses like 5 or 6 different apps to track everything. She is super on top of her medications. She was like really great at keeping track of things, but that wasn't always the case. She ended up in the hospital a couple of times. She didn't know how to identify her symptoms, and had a really tough time for probably a good 6 years until her doctor finally figured out, hey, what you have, like, this is how your condition is manifesting as symptoms. This is why you're tired all the time, and this is why you're in the hospital right now. And once she was able to identify that, she was able to make changes in her life that helped her turn those things around and help her get her condition under control. So, we have kind of what are the actions that she's doing that lead up to her diagnosis, how she's feeling, kind of emotional condition. So, she's feeling really terrible when she has her diagnosis because she feels like she's kind of failed at something, or, she is now a person with a condition. And then we try to understand, opportunities and insights, what happened in that process and how could that be changed to be made better? What are the opportunities for us here? So here, we have her as a passive patient, and then, she has an exacerbation. She ends up in the hospital. She's dizzy. She doesn't know what's happening. And then her doctor connects that to her asthma. Those symptoms that, because she was expecting an asthma attack to look like what she saw on TV, which is, someone gasping, out of breath. But for her, those symptoms were different. And so, when she was finally able to put a label on it, she then could do the research. She actually started exercising. She knew what was happening, and she could tie taking her medications to relief of those symptoms. So, she's doing a lot better. And we were able to talk to her about how COVID-19 has impacted her life. We talked to a lot of people who are, thankfully, a lot of the people that we talked to are able to get the vaccine because they're at high risk, but they were severely impacted by it because they knew that as patients with respiratory conditions, getting COVID-19 was going to be very likely, not a good outcome for them. So yeah, this is a lot of work to put together to make this whole patient journey, but it was a really good kind of illustrative tool to point out, some of these opportunities for change and for improvement. So that's part of the whole kind of user journey understanding piece of things. Moving back in, so we were, for the scoliosis side, we also just, tried to understand what the decision-making process was for doctors, for kind of, what happens when you get diagnosed, what happens in your first visit, what happens, depending on how severe your condition is, what's the course of action. And so we created this chart to help explain it to people. And so, there's a lot of, you can do some of these things to really make that, basically create output to help explain it. You can use this to actually create like nice slides when you're trying to explain it to someone else or when you're trying to present the research back. Other methods for collecting this information, for example, we did a really big survey. So we had a population of patients who had our nebulizer. And we did this huge survey to see, how do people use digital tools? What kind of apps are people using? What kind of devices are people using? Like, do they have a Fitbit? Do they have an Apple Watch? What are the age groups that we're looking at? And so that was actually, that helped us get an understanding and see what are the commonalities. And we could kind of build these profiles. And so sometimes you can use these to build, say, like a persona. And a persona is essentially a stand-in for a group of users to kind of fill out that user experience. So let me also show you guys, because we basically created another group of personas for the users of our iOS app for tracking respiratory conditions. So this is stuff that's somewhat behind the scenes. We actually just generated these this past week. So let's see. There we go. I think I put it in here. Yeah, so just generating these personas. Here we go. Excellent. So, you can actually, from your interviews and from talking to people, you can kind of group out, okay, what are the age ranges of the people that you're talking about? What's their diagnosis journey? Start to group some of the commonalities. What's their background and lifestyle? What are their medications like? So this is, we probably did at least a dozen or so interviews here, and use that to kind of create these groups of people. So identifying goals that they have, frustrations and pain points. So, we can talk about, say, Albert, who's a retired, you add a little bit of this flavor text to kind of really create this human being who's a stand-in. So when you say, hey, we're going to introduce this new feature, how would Albert react to this? And you think about the people that you interview and you say, okay, what are their motivations? And you can see that he's kind of a casual user. He's an expert in knowing what his symptoms are, and he's actually relatively technologically competent. But you can see, what he wants to do, some of the accessibility features that he uses, which is very important to keep in mind when we're starting to design user interfaces, and the devices that he has. So you can kind of see like, okay, Holly is someone who is just diagnosed and is still trying to figure out a routine. So her priorities are going to be different. And the things she's comfortable with are going to be different. All right, I see a hand raised. Do you want
Hi.
to jump
Yes.
in? Yep.
Thank you. Just a quick question. This is super, super cool. So like, for example, Holly here is a persona kind of made up of like, like you do a ton of user interviews and then you find there's a lot of people that kind of match this similar persona and you create Holly to like, and kind of break down all the different groups of people and that's how you create these?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you talk to design professionals and you'd ask them about personas, like some of them have strong opinions about them. I would say they're a really good shortcut. They do have, they do have their pros and cons, but if you're just getting started in it, they're a really good shortcut in kind of like saying, okay, I'm introducing a new feature or an idea. How would, Albert and Holly and, Tiffany react to this thing? And so it's a way of saying like, how do I cover a big group of users? I don't know if you guys can see my video or on the screen behind me, but I have a chart of a normal distribution, which if those of you who've done statistics, it's basically like a normal distribution is kind of like if people fall on a bell curve for any given trait. And in particular, what we do is we for this one, I use it to illustrate like technological kind of competence or comfort with technology. You want to make sure that you're talking to the right people. So for example, a lot of the people who are proactive about responding to user surveys, who are picking up the phone and who are willing to do a user test with us for an hour, they are like 2 standard deviations above the mean in terms of like their ability to engage with technology and their willingness to engage with us. And we actually have a mismatch with one of the doctors that we work with who sees a lot of patients that are like 1 or 2 standard deviations below the mean, because he sees the people who are doing poorly in their diagnosis, and he sees the people who, they don't have a smartphone, or he sees the people who need a caregiver to actually help them with their devices. But it's hard for us to say, we can't necessarily solve the problem for the person who's really, really bad with technology, because if we tried to do that, it would be really hard for us to actually launch anything in the market. So, we want to make sure that we're not just talking to the people who are already predisposed to be excited. So what we are really targeting is like the people in the middle and who are 1 standard deviation kind of outside of the average user. And a lot of times the quantity of data that you're gathering helps you figure out like what is your average user. And that's where you also have to be really clear about your assumptions, because if you make an assumption and say like this person's the average user, but they're actually like way out here, then you can really do yourself a disservice, because you are targeting the wrong group of people, or you're targeting a group of people that only give you a very thin slice of the population. Whereas if you target like the mean, theoretically in a normal distribution, you're getting about 68% of the population if you target kind of within that range. And then you start to build features for the outliers. You can start to build features for the absolute like power users who are really good at technology. And then you can also build features that are for like the really intro users that are not super familiar with technology. So, you kind of can move outwards from there. That can go down a whole rabbit hole of kind of philosophy for who you're building for. But at the end of the day, you have to be clear about, who's the group of people that you want to serve. And also, going from a business perspective, who do you have easy access to? who is a market that is well defined, and when you're trying to make a case to, say, investors, if you're building a business and you say, okay, we're going to solve this problem for this group of people, you need to know, like, how many people is that group, and is that group big enough to make a financial case or make a business case for targeting. So that's less design thinking, more kind of like how you tie that into building a business, which will probably be covered in other innovators toolkits. Cool. All right. So we spent a lot of time on understanding, but it is really important. So I want to make sure that we cover that. So you can see, you know, what that process looks like. These days we do a lot of it virtually, so it's a lot of flow charts and a lot of these. You know, in the before COVID times, and hopefully in the after COVID times, it's a lot more fun if you just you know, grab a box of donuts and a bunch of sticky notes and like just put this all up on a whiteboard. So we spent a lot of time synthesizing that research and just like writing down insights that we got from people, like specific quotes that people would tell us. And it's actually really good to save those quotes and testimonials because those make really good slides as you're presenting the research, because it kind of gives a voice to some of those technologies and insights. So another tactic is just having someone, so in lieu of being able to shadow someone in their office, we actually we grabbed a respiratory therapist and we actually had her just go step by step, really, really clearly saying like, okay, what would you do next? What would you do next? When you see this patient, what do you do next? And actually creating a flow chart of the experience. So you know, we were trying to get an understanding of what her workflow was like. And so, you know, as she brought stuff up, we could say, okay, a patient comes in, here's their diagnosis, here's the type of patients that we get. The first visit, we have them do a medication review, we do a form and assessment, here are all the assessments that we do, and then kind of going through that decision-making process to create these flow charts to then kind of build a better understanding of like, what is her decision-making process, and where are the parts where we can intervene, and where are the parts that we can kind of pop in and make a difference. That's just part of the understanding. Yeah, so, you know, I think there's a lot of tactics that you can take there. This is a tool that I use called Whimsical. It's really good for making flowcharts. If you like flowcharts, this is fantastic for it. I am a big fan of using the right tool for the right job, and I prefer using tools that basically like that don't slow me down. So when you have a lot of thoughts, or when you're doing a lot of research, best practices, use the right tool to take your notes, and then also, like, it is worth spending the time to organize these thoughts. You don't want your notes just all sitting in one long Google Doc in bullet points, because that's really hard to kind of create and synthesize those ideas from. Another big tip is when you're talking to a user, record yourself or have someone sitting in the background taking notes who's not part of the interview, because you will want to have that be more conversational in order to kind of tease out some of those details. And you don't want to be stopping every 30 seconds to like write down the notes or forgetting everything. So you want to keep the flow going so you can get as much information as you can, because user interviews are a really precious resource. You don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do a lot of them all the time. And so you want to make sure that every interview that you can schedule, it's people being generous with their time and giving you their time to help you understand their story. So make the best use of that time as you can.
Ellen, we have one question that came in the chat, which is, what software did you use for the personas?
Oh, the personas. So for this one, we used Figma, which is kind of, it's a little bit overkill for this, but you know, you could honestly just use like Google Slides for this. So there's a ton of tools. Whimsical can also do these kind of like sticky notes, but Figma is actually a tool for user interfaces. We downloaded these illustrations from like free illustration packs. There's a lot of great resources for that, and especially for something internal, you can just kind of grab stuff wherever you want. And then if you're publishing stuff, you want to make sure that you have the proper copyright and permission to use those images. So Figma is basically it's like a digital canvas. If you've ever used like Illustrator, or if you've done kind of user interface design work and you've used Sketch, it's all very similar. It's basically like you can make shapes, you can make text. You know, I'll show you. We basically are using Figma here because everything else that we do is in Figma. So you can see like we're redesigning our app homepage, and you can basically kind of create all these like app design things in Figma. So I'll walk you guys through this process as we go. But you know, it's a really good user interface design tool. We just happen to use it for generating our personas. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of Whimsical. I think they do a really good job for certain things, which are like flow charting and mapping. But honestly, like you can use Google Slides to do that, like a bunch of Post-it notes to kind of solidify the insights, and then just throw it all into a slide deck for to actually share those insights. All right, so yes, so you know, a couple of ideas. It's learning, so doing the research. A lot of that's going to be online. Research studies. We read a lot of research studies. Well, actually, we read a lot of abstracts because we don't necessarily have time to read all of the actual body of the study. But you know, learning that, figuring out one really good tactic that we had was finding a research paper, like, you know, seeing something interesting or an insight there, and then just reaching out to those researchers or that research group to learn more and to actually get a firsthand account of, you know, what were some of the things that didn't make it into the study, or what were some of the things that were particularly surprising. And those researchers ended up being some of our best contacts because they ended up, you know, doing clinical studies for free for us, because we basically were saying like, hey, you guys learned something really interesting, and we want to take what you have and actually apply it in the real world. And I think a lot of researchers don't get the chance to see their research, you know, being applied and having those insights actually tested out with and improving people's lives. And so a lot of them were really, really willing to help. So, you know, and, you know, people reach out to companies all the time, but people don't always reach out to the researchers. So a lot of them were really responsive, which was great. Just sitting and observing is a really powerful tool, because watching what people do tells you a lot that they wouldn't necessarily notice or verbalize. So that's a really good tool. And that's why I'm a big proponent also of shadowing when you get the chance. Asking questions, so that's like us grilling the respiratory therapist about what her process is, and then trying. In the medical context, not as recommended to just go out and try stuff, but in a lot of other contexts, you can actually just go and test something out. So if you're like, okay, what is the process for, you know, ordering fast food, or, you know, doing something else, you can actually just go out and try out those things to make sure that you experience that process firsthand. So, you know, for example, one of the things that we did do here is actually we got measured for scoliosis braces. So we got a scoliosis brace made, and we're like, okay, what is the process for measurement here? How do you tighten it and all of that? So, you know, it's worth experiencing some of that firsthand. And if you run into roadblocks, there are these things called the Ideo method cards, which are, you can kind of find this PDF, or you can like buy a physical set, but it's basically like strategies and tools. So Ideo is like the big name in design thinking and human-centered design. A lot of the resources that you'll see are from them, and a lot of the examples that you'll see are from them. They're kind of like the people who've been doing it the longest, and I would say, you know, kind of created the field. So they have a lot of strategies for learning more. So, seeing like extreme user interviews, you find someone who is extremely familiar or completely unfamiliar. So you try to find those outliers, kind of doing the opposite of the normal distribution. And they'll actually often highlight things that are particularly kind of unusual or experiences that might make things better for a lot more people. So you can kind of draw these cards, or Oblique Strategies, which is it's basically like a set of cards with these cryptic sayings on them, which are basically can help you just think in a different way. So if you kind of refresh, it's like these weird pithy one-liners that are sometimes helpful as strategies. So you can say like, listen to the quiet voice, which actually is really great feedback. So if you, if you're on, if you're in a group, a focus group, for example, and there's someone who's not talking, that can be a good strategy. So, these are sometimes just good tools to get the juices flowing if you run into a roadblock. All right. I know we're like halfway through the time and we've only gotten through step 1, so I'm going to pick things up a little bit. And step 1 is a big step. Like it's a very large part of the process. So we've now empathized. Next step, and what I'll do is actually I'll go through more of the define and the ideate. There's other ways to talk about prototyping, and I'll touch on it briefly, but I'll spend more of the time on kind of the defining and ideation portion. So defining, this is actually where we narrow in. So now we've gotten like this big understanding. We have a ton of information and a lot of people's experiences, a lot of data, a lot of numbers floating around. So now we have to figure out like what actually is the problem that we're solving. And that is where we come up against a really good tool for this is to create a how might we or how can we statement. So this is another like core thing that is pretty common to the design thinking process. You'll see this come up if you kind of learn about design thinking, but essentially like this is the statement that both scopes out the how big of a problem you're solving and identifies a particular group of users, and it points you in the right direction for coming up with solutions. Now that's, it's one sentence doing like triple duty there. So crafting that sentence can be its own challenge. So I'll just walk you through a couple of different strategies for that. So really quick, kind of a good how might we statement has a user with a problem, it has an action, a goal, or an objective, and it synthesizes the research that you've gathered. It's also specific enough to generate concrete ideas while it's broad enough to generate more than one solution. So I'll show you, I'm actually really bad with the scoping side of things. So we took a shortcut and said, we're actually going to create like 50 how might we statements and turn them into a tree. So here's this tree. So for the scoliosis one, this was a tool that really helped us. Was we kind of created this like really big question of how might we improve quality of life for people with scoliosis, and that is way too broad, because that you're really only focusing on one group of people. And that was actually, it was kind of hard to, we would basically just be coming up with the same ideas here. So we actually started breaking it down into smaller and smaller kind of how might we or how can we statements. So we broke that into, how can we reduce the need for surgery or improve the whole treatment experience? And this is, under each of these things, I don't know if you guys can see this, but we basically put some of the insights that we generated. So, why are we reducing the need for surgery? Well, the surgery is the most expensive part. It also is the part that leads to the highest health complications. And, there's kind of various insights that we generated from there. And then the treatment experience kind of speaks to the emotional experience of the patients that we were trying to help. We then broke each of these into smaller and smaller chunks. So, how can we better track the progression of the scoliosis? how can we increase rates of scoliosis screening? How can we increase compliance with scoliosis braces? How can we make the bracing experience more positive? How can we increase psychosocial health through better educational materials or better support, emotional support? The question up here is too broad. The questions down here are probably a little too specific. So, how might we increase accuracy of scoliosis screening really only lends itself to like one category of solutions and limits us to just looking at, it's great because you can think of a lot of ideas around that, but it is somewhat narrow. So, we ended up looking kind of in this middle layer of questions, and we went to, how can we better provide feedback and measure kind of bracing compliance? So we didn't commit to that right off the bat. We actually had all of these how can we statements because we didn't want to choose just one. And what was really great is that for each of these questions we could come up with like 5 to 6 ideas, which means that for 15, 16, 17, 17 different how might we statements with 5 or 6 ideas each, that meant we were like well over 100 ideas, where if you asked us to start here at the very top, we maybe would have generated like 10 total. So this is a really good tool because the more specific you get here, the more you can actually create better ideas. So that was one kind of process tree. I'll show you guys for the respiratory side what we were doing here. So one of the things that we were looking at is we had this iOS app that was measuring medication compliance, and we wanted to redesign the homepage. So we were taking a lot of the user research that we were looking at and some of the goals that we were setting, and we created kind of these how might we statements. Let's see, here we go. How might we encourage habit building? How might we help establish a daily routine? How might we help patients understand what their medication adherence, how it ties to their symptoms? How might we provide value to a large range of users with different priorities? So we also generated a bunch of these how might we statements and then started grouping them into into these categories of, you end up with these themes. And then from these themes, you can start to draw out like bigger and kind of better scoped how might we statements. So that's the how might we statement. Going back to the good how might we statement, like I said, it's a sentence that does a lot of work, which means that it does deserve its own kind of time in here. So you might generate one, you might generate 15, and it kind of comes down to like how you want to approach this. So now we get into the narrowing, which is picking just one, maybe 2 how might we statements to start creating ideas around. So what is it you're actually building? So kind of this is where we get the kind of expand contract, where you diverge, you create choices, and then you converge and you make choices. And you want to create those choices because a lot of times, like, you want to get all those crazy ideas out there because sometimes those can spark really interesting and innovative ideas. You just have to give them a chance. And it's good to do this both individually and in a group so that you can actually remix ideas and you can, combined come up with something that's better than what's out there. So like I said before, here was our idea list. So you can see, the same how might we tree in a much more raw form, and all of the ideas that came out of it. Like we had one idea per sticky note and we generated a ton. So this is where you really want to spend that time, and also, have a little fun with that. So those are the teammates for the scoliosis side of things. Just taking a look at, so what you're seeing is what we did like literally 3 weeks ago for our homepage redesign. What we did was like, what is a homepage? What is not? What is the purpose of this, and what is not the purpose of this? And we started brainstorming ideas. So we had like, a lot of these ideas based on the how might we's. We took our how might we's here. You can see them actually right here. These are the 3 that we came out with from that first session, and we we put these at the top of the board and then started creating these ideas. So we had time by ourselves, we had time to talk and compare. This is really like just go whole hog. One way to prepare for this kind of thing is also we did an exercise that we called an innovation safari. So this is something that we did on the side, like as homework between the how might we session and between this session. So we actually went through example apps, and we looked at, for this, we were tracking medications, but someone found an example of like, hey, I really like my app that I use to track if I watered my houseplants. I sign into that every day, and I do this, and I make sure that something doesn't die. We drew analogies to, kind of New Year kind of resolution apps. We drew analogies to like, like keeping track of an infant versus like keeping track of yourself or keeping track of an older relative. So ways to, looking at other apps that do a good job of this, highlighting things that were good, highlighting things that didn't work, looking at reviews for those things. So we did kind of that innovation safari. I see more questions in the chat, so I'm happy to take some questions there also.
That was me in the chat, just commending
cool.
you on the use of Mural, because Mural is another great one. Yeah, Mural is really good for whiteboards and sticky notes. You can vote on ideas, you can set timers. It is like tailor-made for that. There is another tool called Miro, M-I-R-O. You have to really enunciate to tell the difference between them. Basically do the same thing. The reason I use both of them is because your free trial gets you like 3 boards in each of them, which means if we need more boards, we usually change the platform. I'm a big fan of finding free tools also. Yeah, excellent. So this is our ideation session. So then from here, moving into narrowing, so prioritizing. So now we're refining. When you're refining, there's a lot of different tools that you can do. So at this point, you hopefully have like a bajillion ideas on the board. And there's a lot of things that you can do to narrow that down, because eventually you're going to get down to like 3 or 1 that you want to test and that you're trying to narrow down. So I'm just going to actually show you guys a couple of different frameworks for doing that and kind of how that plays out specifically. So one is this what I call the DFV Venn diagram. So desirability, feasibility, and viability. So desirability is how much do people want it? You've talked to users, and so hopefully you've got a good idea, and you can kind of pose ideas to people. So you can say, okay, well, we talked to 5 people who independently suggested that they wanted this thing, and you're like, okay, great, clearly it's desirable. Feasibility is, can you actually make this with the tools or resources that you have, or that you could reasonably hope to obtain? So is this technologically possible, either in the world today or in the near future? And then the third one is viability. Well, basically, will someone pay for it? Can this become a good business idea? Now, this one is the viability one is actually really hard to get a handle on sometimes. And that's where you have to talk to potential customers, and you get like a willingness to pay argument. You say, if I provided this, would you pay for this? Or you look at what do other companies currently pay for? So you say like, okay, this similar product in a different space, people pay this much for it.
That's where you're like, is there a business model that you can build around this? The thing that is missing here is actually, do you personally want to work on this? There's a lot of great ideas out there, and sometimes, sometimes you're not the one to make them. So if we go back to this, how might we chart actually? So when we created this, one of the ideas here was increasing rates of scoliosis screening, and we said, like, is there a way to increase awareness and increase accuracy and make it cheaper and easier? And we're like, yes, the way that we are going to reduce the need for surgery is by increasing rates of screening, catching it early. And, an idea that we had was, okay, if you can screen kids in states that don't mandate school screening, which was like 25 states, I think, at that point. If you can provide a cheaper, low cost way of doing that, you can basically like drive around the country in a van screening kids for scoliosis, and then the schools don't have to do it, and you make it cheaper for everybody. And so like we were all about this. We're like, okay, it's desirable, it's technologically feasible, we think there's a good business model for it. Let's start doing this. We gave it a name. It was going to be called Moby Scoli. And then like a week into it, we're like, do any of us actually want to drive around in a van and screen kids for scoliosis? And we all looked at each other and we're like, not really. We don't, like, we personally do not want to do this. And at that point we hadn't really invested anything in it. So, there was no kind of sunk cost there. So we're like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and like, let's pick another idea that we like, that our skills are good at, that our skills would complement, because we're basically like, none of us are medical professionals. You would need to hire like a nurse or someone to actually do this. There's all this infrastructure that you have to do, and kind of understanding that we just didn't have. So we
sorry,
pivoted from there.
I have a question. So the idea you started out was just, more broad, is it? Just the how to improve the quality, and then but you didn't have any idea it's going to be an app, it's going to be braces, it's going to be. You didn't have that in mind.
No, not at all. So we intentionally didn't have any ideas to start out. We just said, let's listen first, and let's let that tell us what we should work on.
But then how does this translate into a business, I guess, viable option of screening where they don't do it? I mean.
Yeah, so that's where we were saying, well, okay, let's see how much money do schools spend on training nurses to screen? What is the kind of lost productivity? So if we said that, one nurse has to screen over a week, like 300 kids in an elementary school, and the kids get pulled out of class, and that's, loss in effectiveness, and each school has to send their nurse for training. So if we come to them and we say on a city level, can they hire us to do the screening similar to a mobile health clinic, or like a mammogram screening van where they drive around and actually, they go to businesses or they go to health clinics. They have the equipment in their van, they have trained professionals. So then, we looked at basically other businesses that got paid to do kind of this mobile screening service, and said like, well, okay, there's a business model here that works, that other people are using in a different area. We can point to them as an example and say like, there's, we need to do more investigation, of course, but there's potentially something here as a business, which I still think is a great idea. We ended up, someone actually did end up kind of creating this mobile like screening training program, which was great. And we talked to them a bunch about that. So not every idea has to be the one that you work on. Life is too short to work on something that you're not excited to work on. So that's a big consideration for yourself as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we ended up focusing on, increasing brace compliance, monitoring, providing feedback, and helping people kind of better understand their condition.
Another thing to look at is also this kind of difficulty and importance matrix. So then you would say, okay, let's take maybe like our top 10 ideas that we have that we want to do, and let's rank them. So you rank them first on importance, most to least important, and then you move them up and down on the difficulty until you get this graph. And then you look at the quadrants. So you say, okay, what is most important and least difficulty? That's what you should build first, right? That's what you should focus on first, because it is a high value kind of easy win. Something that's really important but also really difficult, that's what you set up in the background. So for example, the classic thing in healthcare is getting insurance reimbursement for things. Like, that is super important. It's critical to the success of the business, but also incredibly difficult. So you have to set up all the pieces in place in the background so that everything that you're doing moves towards this strategic goal. And then you've got a couple of other things. So you get like things that are not important, but really easy to do. And some of those you kind of do in between. They're a distraction. They can be a distraction, but you can also, they keep people delighted. And then the things that you really don't want to do are the least important and most difficult things. Like that, you can kind of nix this whole quadrant because you don't have the time or the resources to do that. So that's another tool. I mean, as you're going through this design sprint, you can see like we basically did a bunch of voting, and we had two decision makers, like stakeholders. So one was the head of the company, and then one was the head of the product team, which is me, to say like, what do we want to focus on building? And then the head of the company was like, what is strategically important for this business? And voting on the ideas that we should focus on, or at least the areas. So, we came up with really specific ideas here. So it's like, we show this specific graph, but we were able to zoom out into kind of broader idea categories. And then we kind of refined the ideas. This is where we get into prototyping. So I'm just going to move into how do you test this? You've now decided what you're working on, but now you actually need to like get feedback on it, start building prototypes, start getting feedback on it as soon as you can, because you need to feed it back into this cycle, right? Ideally, you want to do this cycle quickly, especially in your early days. You want to iterate through this as fast as you can, because the more you can talk to users and the more you can show them something and they can react to something, the better your ideas will be. So, and what you're trying to do with the prototype phase, and this is, again, you're narrowing down, you've selected your ideas. In the prototype phase, you're trying to bridge the gap between what people say and what people do. Because you can show someone something and they'll say like, oh, I love this. Like, I will, I'll pay for this. I'll love this. I'll buy this. You do not believe them until they actually like hand you the money, and that money hits your bank account. Like, do not believe anything that people say, because people will tell you a lot of things. They might fully intend to do those things, but when it comes down to it, when they're looking at their budget, when they're pulling out their credit card, that is a huge point. Like, that's a huge decision-making point. So you're trying to eliminate this gap within your prototyping, so that you can actually get to making sure that people are using what you're making, or paying for what the product or the service that you're offering. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to basically force users to kind of make those decisions and imagine themselves in that process. So you can either have them kind of pretend to do it, and get to the point where you can even kind of trick them into thinking that they're actually buying the product or using the product. And then they can tell you like, oh, actually, if you don't have this, I wouldn't use this. Or, if it had this, I would absolutely pay for it. So you're trying to get to some of those really specific pieces of feedback. And then another kind of good quote is, prototyping is essentially a way to think where something is brought from a place of theory to a place of tangibility. So you can describe something to someone, but they won't actually be able to give you good feedback until they imagine themselves actually using it in their lives. So that takes a lot of different forms. And there's a lot of kind of ways to do prototyping without building the real thing. And you want to lean on those things as much as possible, because this is where you have to be really ruthless about the resources that you have and the time that you have. Because you either, you might have skills and the ability to build things, but you don't have infinite time. And so you're limited by the time you can spend building things. You might not have skills, but you might have a little bit of funding. And so you can hire people to build things, or you can buy materials, but you don't have an infinite amount of that either. Or, you need to get into the market really fast because there are people that are already moving and you need to test this out. So you don't have time, but you might have funding. So, you'll have some combination of those, and you're trying to run as many tests as you can with those resources that you have. So one way to do that, you can actually start really simply, is drawing a picture. So you can draw a picture, you can kind of create like a photoshopped model. So this is actually exactly one of the images that we used. As soon as we settled on an idea, we said, okay, what if we could track, how long and how tight scoliosis braces were being worn. We were basically like, okay, I want to talk to a doctor about this. And so this is where me being an art major came in handy, because I was able to draw this, and you can always, find a friend or hire someone to draw the picture and say, this is what this looks like. Can you imagine one of your patients using it? And we got a lot of really good feedback. We said like, well, this piece can't jut out too much, or, users are concerned. Like they said, okay, well, they really don't want anything that might shine through their clothes. So you got to get rid of the lights on it. And that was really good feedback. And so, we got rid of the lights. They said, okay, well, tell me about how this works. What happens when I'm tightening this? Showing them these things gave us really, really concrete feedback, which was fantastic. And at the same time, you're also trying to make sure, you're trying to validate that feasibility side of things, like, can I build this? So like I said before, you're also trying to do the, here we go, the looks like and works like gap. So you're trying to show people what it looks like so they can imagine themselves doing it. And then in the background, you're like working super hard to make sure that it works the way that you're expecting as well. So in terms of like digital experiences, what you're trying to do is going from basically like low fidelity to high fidelity. So, low fidelity, you can do this in, like a couple of minutes. You could sketch out what it looks like. And then people can say, okay, there's an image here, there's text here, what would you click on? Like, how would you go through this process? You then start to put in those pieces, and then you can kind of fill in how it looks and pretend it's a real app. And this is actually exactly what we did here in this design sprint. We did this exercise called Crazy Eights, which is, we generated all of these sketches in 8 minutes. You fold a piece of paper into eights, and then you basically just do a bunch of sketches. And it's a way of just like getting those ideas and manifesting them. And then we could actually vote and say like, oh, I really like these, emojis on a how are you feeling today? Or, I really like, some of the pieces. You're basically voting on the elements that you like, and starting to kind of mash those into an actual interface or product. So, and you can do this, this lends itself to things that can be sketched out. You can do it with a service. For example, you can actually walk someone through an experience. So you can say, okay, well, if I give you a link to sign up for an event and you get this email, we'll mail you this package. And then you can kind of go through this experience. Or you set up, like I have in an office, just set up like a simulated doctor's room. And we have someone like wear a white coat and say, okay, we're going to pretend to be a doctor. We're going to walk you through this process. Like, where are the pieces that make sense to you? Where are the pieces that don't make sense to you? So you're kind of simulating the service as you're testing it, because you really only get a chance to build something like this once. again, back to tools that are really useful. So I know I showed you guys Figma. One thing that's really great with Figma is that you can create interactive prototypes. So I can show you guys. So we've got kind of an interactive prototype here. None of this stuff, like some of this stuff is coded now, but none of this stuff is actually like in this file is built, and it's loading because we have a massive file. But what you can do is you can kind of say, I have a button here. So you can see, I'm gonna play this. Let's see if this works. So you can set up like the buttons and the screen interfaces to actually like click and go places and say, if I click on this, it will go to this other place. So if I click on this app, you know, it goes to the sign-in page. So all of this stuff is not actually coded up, but it looks like a real app. And I can show this to someone and say, okay, so now look at this page. Tell me what you see here. What would you do next? And so I could say, well, I will check off this medication. I will, you know, I'll, you know, click on certain things. I can do certain pieces of this. So you can simulate an app for someone, and sometimes people can't tell the difference, which is great. So you can, you know, you can do some of this. And this is actually, this is the homepage that we are redesigning because it is pretty plain. And we're trying to make it more engaging. So, you know, here are some of the things. And so what we're going to do is actually, we're going to simulate this and kind of create better interfaces for it so that we can have our developers build it. So here you can see that we refined some of these interfaces. We pointed out some of the things that we were going to test. And we have now translated. So we kind of settled on these 3 things to test. And we're actually moving into user testing this week. So you're catching us right at a really good point for actually user testing. So I can show you guys. So, you know, the stuff that you saw earlier is actually us building our user tests and all the different variations. So you can see here is we're going to test like these, you know, 3 different versions of this. We'll show people one, and then we'll show them actually, you know, was this clear to you? Tell us a little bit about that. So that's where you get into like user testing techniques. And I could talk for another like 2 hours on that. I won't, just to spare you guys some time. But that's the testing part of it. This slide is really great because it shows you kind of like a early stage, mid stage, and late stage prototype for a bunch of different types of products. So, you know, can you test your marketing in an early stage versus a mid stage versus a late stage? Can you test a product with a physical prototype? Can you test an experience and walk people through an experience at various different points? So that's where you really try to get feedback. So yeah, so that's kind of the process. When you're choosing how, okay, sorry, so a lot of times what you'll hear is this prototype that you're testing often gets called a minimum viable product. So that is the version of your product that allows you to collect the maximum amount of information with the minimum amount of kind of effort and resources. Again, because it's a trade-off between how much time you have and how many resources you have versus how much you can learn. And really, you know, what you're trying to do is you're doing it at a low fidelity, you're doing it fast, and you're focusing, you know, every test you run, it's good science to just focus on a single hypothesis, because sometimes if you change 5 things and someone reacts well or poorly to it, you don't know which of those things really, you know, made the difference. And then also you can test a whole versus a part. You can test the whole experience, or you can, you know, do smaller tests with more people on smaller pieces of it. So yeah, so it's really a process of just like answering assumptions and getting closer to, you know, is this a viable product? Will someone use this? Is this something that people want? And, you know, is this something that I can make a business case for? So you're trying to answer all those questions, and, you know, you really kind of try to tackle those one at a time. That is where I will end it for now, because you know, we've got our little image here where
we end with testing. That's kind of the design thinking process in a nutshell. I know we've only got about 10 minutes, but I'm happy to open it up to questions, and I'm also happy to stay a little bit longer if that's helpful. So yeah, I will let Ellen take it away with questions. Feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat as well. But yeah, that's my experience. I hope that was helpful. I am also happy to share these slides. So Ellen or Matt, I can export these and send these along.
That would be wonderful. We'll make sure to send an email to everyone. Yeah. If you have questions, anyone, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question. First of all, thank you so much. This was just so dense with useful insights and information, and great illustrations. My question is, for that very initial starting point for the design thinking process, I understand the benefits for starting with Empathize and trying to pick kind of a problem that other people are experiencing. But I'd also imagine, on the other hand, that you develop a certain area of expertise for types of problems that you're more inclined to solve. Does that factor into that initial starting point? Like,
yeah,
what problems am I equipped, but based on my toolkit and my expertise, to actually solve?
Right, absolutely. Everybody has to start somewhere. You can't just say, I'm going to talk to like a random sampling of people and try to understand a problem that all of these people have. That is actually one thing that can really help differentiate, especially if you're starting a business, is you and your experience. You might have access to people that don't have, that aren't being served. Or you're noticing a particular problem that people are having, and that can kick off this whole journey. So if you say, usually if everything's going well, you're not out there like looking for problems, but it's usually that you've noticed a group of people having trouble with something. And so really what this is not jumping straight into solutions, but really, this would start off the process of, okay, let me talk to these people. Let me see if there are more people that also have this problem, or let me see if this is actually the problem that they're having, or if there's something bigger or a different problem that's more pressing. And it's using those threads as a way to say, like, this is what sparks my curiosity in this, and this is what inspires me to learn more. And that's kind of the initial spark that gets you going and kind of starts this whole process.
Ellen, we have a question in the chat, which is that how can you use Figma for service rather than for products? Do you have any tips about how to adapt it?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't pick Figma for the specific tool, because it's I would say it's really good for mocking up interfaces, but that's really what it's geared for. I mean, the other thing that it's good for is being like a shared canvas. So it's good as a brainstorming tool there. But if you're mocking up a service, I would say like that looks usually more like a flow chart or set of kind of experience maps. So just based off of my intuition, I would probably use Whimsical for that, just because it's a little faster to kind of get flowcharts together. Honestly, there's a huge overlap between what Figma can do, what Mural can do, what Whimsical can do. And it really comes down to, what are you most comfortable with? And, they do have particular strengths. And if one of those strengths is kind of within what you're working on, that can be the right choice. But otherwise, if you're just getting started, honestly, any of them can be a good tool. If you want to spend your time kind of configuring shapes and creating that, you can absolutely do that in Figma. It's just the learning curve, I think, is a little bit steeper there. But yeah, so if you're mapping out an experience, I would say, in this one, you've got this kind of like stakeholder map or journey map. So I'm actually going to be doing this exact thing, but I'll probably do it in Whimsical, and I'm going to be mapping out, the patient experience for going to signing up for a virtual respiratory therapy program. So I'm going to say, okay, this person gets their diagnosis, they get referred into this, and basically kind of create like a choose your own adventure map. And then what I would do is I would probably, in the first interview, I would talk to someone who's done respiratory therapy and ask about their experience, and then kind of like talk them through, okay, what would happen if you do this? Like, would you be comfortable picking up the phone? Or, your respiratory therapist calls you and says, please schedule a meeting, and you get a link. So, I would basically talk through that experience with them.
Thank you so much. And I know it sounded like Lavanya was trying to ask a question as well.
I did. Thank you for noticing that. Okay, so Ellen, I have a question in the sense, what if you have an idea and the market space seems to be, crowded?
Mm-hmm.
But however, you find that this need is not met or it's not sufficiently met, and you still literally have this feeling that, oh my God, I mean, this is not enough. What would you do at that stage? Do you investigate the problem more and go through the how can I and see maybe how else can the issue be tackled, or change the way you ask questions or look at it in a different way?
Yeah, so a lot of this is a lot of the design thinking tool is also a way to protect you. It's a way to make sure that you're focusing on the right problem so you don't spend too much time and putting too many resources down something that's not going to pan out. So if you have an idea, like in this process, ideas actually aren't very important. Any individual idea, like in the ideation portion, like you end up with hundreds of ideas, ideally. And each individual idea in there should be kind of equally considered. I think there's a danger of kind of getting a blind spot for an idea that you're really passionate about. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're really, I think at least the thing that sustains me is making sure that you're solving a problem for someone. And the way that you solve that problem is not important because circumstances change, right? That idea might be the right idea right now or in certain conditions, but as we've all learned in the past year, the world can change dramatically. There are a lot of great ideas that are not good ideas in this day and age, and there are a lot of ideas that were not good ideas that actually became good ideas. So that's all that to say, in this process, you can kind of further refine that idea and focus on the people that really have it. And sometimes the decision might be like, there is someone else working in this space, but they're not solving the problem correctly, or, they're not actually fixing, they're close, but they're, I think we can solve this better. And that shouldn't stop you from putting that idea out there, but you just have to be really clear-eyed about saying, okay, do people actually care if I solve this problem? And if I do solve this problem and there's people, like, is it 10 people that have this problem and I'm solving it for 10 people, or is it 100,000 people that have this problem and I'm solving it for that number of people? And do those people care enough to say, like, okay, you're solving this problem that I have, and this is a really important problem to me, and I will pay you, I will help you, and this is something that I would purchase or that I would use. Versus, you could say, like, okay, well, I like your solution, this solves a problem, but this isn't a big enough problem for me, or I have other problems that are more important to be solved, and this isn't a priority. So what you're trying to understand is this, and how important is this problem, how many people have this problem, and then you look at, okay, what are the solutions out there that either are or aren't addressing them, and then you can make an informed decision about, do I jump into this space? But yeah, I mean, and also in a lot of markets, there's a lot of competition out there. You hear about like first mover advantage. A lot of times it's not the idea that's important, it's the execution. Like, a lot of people have had the same idea that a lot of startup companies, you could say, like, oh, I had that idea, or wouldn't it be great if we did this? But the ones that are successful are the ones that execute really, really well. And so, first mover advantage is a slight bump. You can invent something new and that's great, and nobody's ever heard of it, so you're the only person in that space. But if you are tackling the same problem as someone else and you just do it dramatically better, like that's totally valid. And you can build, you know, and sometimes you can say, I'm going to learn from the mistakes of the first mover in this space. You know, they're in this space, but they haven't been doing a good job. So I'm going to do this better. And you can kind of take that over. So yeah, I mean, and I see a question in the chat about, you know, worrying about the grander idea being taken if someone thinks of an upgrade on your MVP. The only time I would worry about this is that if you have a really big company that's a direct competitor in your space, like if you try to take on Google or if you try to take on like other places that are much better resource, like that can sometimes, you know, land you into hot water because they have the resources to actually just corner the market and, you know, drive competitors out of business. So that is one thing that, you know, you might be concerned about. I would say, you know, if you're targeting a big market, usually if you're testing out your minimum viable product, it's because it's not that nobody has had that idea or nobody is serving them. It's just nobody has done it well. And so again, you don't have to be the first. Being the first is great because there's a lot of advantages to that. But if you're the first in a completely different market, like sometimes you will run into a lot of resistance being the first, that being the second mover can actually be an advantage sometimes. So I don't know if that answered the question. But you oftentimes that big idea, that grander idea or that vision, that will adjust and change as you learn things from your minimum viable product. And a big part of the design thinking framework is being flexible. It's adapting to change. It's adapting to those changing assumptions that you're making. So, you know, if someone, because you're kind of like, when you're doing your Empathize and you're doing your research, you're saying like, what is the current state of the market, or what is the current state of, you know, this problem? And what you're doing there is you're trying to get an understanding of, you know, what is the space that you're stepping into. The thing that can get you in trouble is that if you only do that once, right? You should constantly be looking to upgrade your understanding of the market. And so if conditions change, and that can be, you know, someone else enters the space, or, you know, someone else has put in a product that's like similar, you can say, okay, this is more data to add to your understanding. That doesn't change. That doesn't mean that what you're working on is no longer valid. It just means that you might have to adjust your course. And, you know, that goes by a lot of different names. But, you know, pivoting is not an issue. And actually, if you're a business that doesn't pivot, it usually means that either like you are in a market that everybody else is completely ignoring and the market has not changed, or you are not doing enough research. Like you're not being responsive enough to changes in the marketplace. You know, if a business didn't pivot to go virtual, for example, over the past year, like it's not that they had the best idea, it's that circumstances changed, the world changed, and you know, the ones who were able to adapt to it and not get stuck on, I have to do things exactly this way because this is, you know, this is my idea. Those businesses are the ones that survived and were able to kind of adapt to the changing condition. You know, but you don't always get as big of a change as you do with COVID. You don't always get this like huge world shaking, like, you know, single turning point kind of change. A lot of times that looks like a lot of small changes adding up and responding to those.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I know we are at just past 7 o'clock, so I would like to respect your time and thank you so very much. This is fantastic. I've been a fan of design thinking for a while. I've sat in on so many of these seminars, but I always learned something new. This was truly wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks for hosting me. Always happy to chat. Feel free to pass along my contact info to anybody, and for anybody who's in the session, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I think you'll just find me if you search for Ellen Sue here. I'm just gonna put it, if anybody's writing right now. But also, you don't have to write this down ASAP. I'll send it to Matt and And I will also send along these slides so you can take a look, and hopefully, it sparks something. But I'm a big fan of design thinking. It's something that I try to incorporate into all of our processes, and I think it makes for kind of better products, better solutions out there for everybody.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ellen, for leading all this, and thank you, Ellen, for helping to moderate and manage all the questions and feedback in the back end. Also, one quick note before everyone closes out, we do really, really appreciate the feedback link that Ellen put in the chat. It is super helpful for us to keep going with these different workshops and also just planning for future. So if you don't mind taking like 2 minutes to fill that out, it's super, super helpful. So that would be awesome. And thank you for giving us your time. We know it's really valuable, and thanks for coming. And if we can be of any more help, feel free to reach out anytime. So everyone have a good rest of the night, and we will see you sometime soon.